Olá, eu sou o Gustavo Montezano. Tenho o prazer de estar aqui com vocês em mais um capítulo do nosso BNDES Verde. A gente vai estar falando com uma série de especialistas, empresários, acadêmicos, pessoas que entendem do setor verde, como a gente pode gerar renda e atividade econômica e, ao mesmo tempo, preservar o meio ambiente do nosso Brasil. E hoje a gente vai ter um papo muito especial com Jim Barbarok e com a Jo Pendry, que são dois especialistas renomados sobre a concessão de parques florestais nos Estados Unidos e em vários países do mundo. Espero que vocês gostem. O papo está muito divertido e a gente vai aprender muito sobre o tema hoje. So, Jim, let's start with you. I mean, in your view, what would you consider like good benchmarks for Brazil abroad? I mean, which countries or regions or model would recommend for Brazil to take as a benchmark or some guidance for us to build this industry in Brazil?
I'll start talking about perhaps some examples from Latin America, and then Joe can complement that with examples from the US and other parts of the world. In Latin America, the countries that have the longest track record and where there's probably a lot of good experience and also lessons learned from things that did not go well would be Argentina and Chile, which like the US or Canada or New Zealand have even ski areas within their protected areas in the Andes. Hotels, restaurants, gift shops, and the like, and a long tradition. Chile also has a lot of experience with everything from ski areas to hotels to hot springs within their protected areas. Galapagos in Ecuador, which was the first World Heritage Site in the world and has a long tradition of managing visitation, is another specific national park in Latin America with a long tradition that might provide useful models for places like Fernando de Noronha and marine and coastal environments. Colombia has had both good and bad experience. Their first large concessionaire had one of their concessions affected by a volcanic explosion, another by major floods, and another by a guerrilla invasion. And I'm not talking about gorillas, the animals, I'm talking about the bad guys. And so they had several of their largest concessions affected negatively by either natural events or by political strife. Costa Rica and more recently Colombia have taken an interesting model of focusing on working with communities and neighbors and building on working with people who were commercial fishermen or artisanal fishermen and turning them into sport fishing guides for fly fishing, for example. And so that's another approach of working not just with large corporations, but of working with small and medium-sized enterprises, usually with local capital and people who live in or next to protected areas.
Large countries, of course, Brazil is as large as the United States. The United States has a long history of concessions, having actually had concessions in parks before they were established as U.S. national parks well over 100 years ago. And so the U.S., I think, is a good case to look at because of all of the change that it has gone through, not really in its first 60 years of concessions, but what's happened in the last 30 or 35 years with a new law being implemented and lots of regulation changes, making the opportunities more available to other people and trying its best not to always use the same companies over and over again. But other large countries come to mind. One is Canada. Canada has a much more decentralized concessions program where each of the territories get to pretty much do their own thing, but it's still very effective. And a lot of times, and I'm traveling around the world, I see park systems create these parks that they put up on a pedestal and they don't get used by the people, so they're not loved, and it does not put forth a good scenario for generating revenue or support for those park systems if people can't go in them. So I think our Organic Act in the U.S. really helps with that protection and also use. Having that dual role is very helpful. Other smaller countries have really good initiatives. Africa has some very good policies in place, and I like to always shout out to Namibia because they have established transparent regulations with community involvement, which is also very important.
Quite interesting. So it seems that we do have a lot of benchmark to look at, right? So it's good because we can learn from those experiences and trying to do the Brazilian way of doing that. What's the main source of revenue on those concessions? Are food, tickets, hotels? I mean, sharing space, I mean, sharing land with other operators. In general, how a forest concession pays for itself?
Well, the primary revenue in most concession operations is food and beverage. That is typically the largest revenue generator amongst concessions. Secondarily to that would be hotel or camping, those types of operations. And then the next large chunk is what we would call in the U.S. the recreation activities, things like outfitter and guide services, rafting services, hiking, horseback riding, all of those types of activities. And then smaller chunks of revenue can come from transportation services if you include those in your concession contract.
It's really within the hospitality, I would say, industry, right? It seems that that's the most close to the park's concession. Regarding the community or the region or the park itself, in general, in your experience, what are the impacts when, I would say, before and after you concession a park? What changes in the community and in the park in general?
Well, that, I think, to lead from the last question, the first thing that's important to mention is that if a country or an agency thinks that it's going to cover all of the cost of its park system from concessions, it's starting off really bad. Imagine that the United States National Park Service, which is 104 years old, gets, and Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, about $100 million or something like that in revenue from its concessions, and I think our Forest Service gets about the same amount, when their budgets are $3 billion. So you're talking about a very sophisticated concession system that's been around for 100 years, only generating a tiny percent of the overall operating cost of the agency. And even when you add in entrance fees, the vast majority of the budget of the U.S. park system, or even of some Latin American countries famous for ecotourism like Costa Rica, comes from general budget revenues. So if you start off thinking that concessions and commercial activities are going to fund the majority of the cost of your park system, you might have a few parks that do quite well, like the Tijucas and Iguazus. But what about the remote areas in the Amazon that get a few hundred visitors a year? So it's very important to start from thinking about the main function of concessions is not to self-fund the entire protected area system. It is primarily to increase the number and diversity of recreational and educational opportunities and of visitor services, so that you have what we call in the United States happy campers, people that come to your areas that get excellent services beyond what government could provide, and that leave those areas with lasting memories, and they become advocates for the parks and recommend their friends to visit the parks. And the other side on the local communities, going to your specific question, is that they see more opportunities for employment, for sales of agricultural goods, fisheries products, artisanry, and more income and taxes being generated for local municipalities. So your local leaders, your local citizenry, your local chamber of commerce sees positive economic benefits at the same time. But if you start thinking that concessions are going to solve the financial problems of your protected area systems, you're starting on the wrong foot.
The other thing that's interesting to look at is something the U.S. does called the revenue generation model. It every other year it analyzes, I think, 50% of its parks for the revenue not only generated by that park, but the revenue generated because that park is there. So it shows, for example, in a small town of Luray, Virginia, outside of Shenandoah National Park, this revenue model will show the impact of that park on the local community. The World Bank recently started a study to expand this revenue generation model to show the impact of tourism in parks. They picked 4 countries, and Brazil was one of the countries where they are doing this analysis. And they're about 75% complete with this study, which will help to show, I think I think they did 4 different areas within Brazil, 4 different parks, and they will help you to see how much revenue is being generated, not necessarily by concessions, but including concessions and also including all the other economic activity that may not have happened in that area if it were not for a national park being present.
It's something we haven't discussed yet is that what happens to the money once you generate it? There are a number of countries, Namibia is one, Chile is another, where the money does not automatically go back to the agency or even part to the park that generates it. So this creates tremendous frustration among the staff of the conservation agencies. If they're doing their best to manage the park and they have a whole lot of new concessions, big and small, and yet none of the revenue, the royalties or the fees paid by the concessionaires is trickling down to improve the management of their parks. So they're seeing additional cost and they're seeing no benefit to having these public-private partnerships. So it's extremely important to get the laws and policies right so that, like in the United States, a large percentage of the concessions fees goes back to the park that generates it. In some countries, some of it goes to local communities as well. And even if it doesn't all go to the park, if it goes to the central government coffers, to the basically to the budget ministry, then you're going to see tremendous frustration from the conservation sector that they're not seeing benefits from the economic return on these concessions.
When you concession a park, we shouldn't look at the opportunity as a financial source for the federal government, right? We should look at that as an opportunity for the community that's there, living and I would say creating a business in the environment of the park, and also for the visitors. Like as Joe just said, we improve the hospitality opportunities in Brazil. Like we're going to have more tourists, both domestic and international. So it's a social investment. It's not a financial investment. When we look at the financial revenues from the royalties, I think that there are some ways that the agent or the national unit that takes care of the park can benefit. Revenues, some part of the financial revenues, but also infrastructure, right? They can benefit from cars, helicopters, boats, facilities to do their job, right? Do you think it's a useful way of thinking as well as how can the concession benefit the national agent?
Very much so. A lot depends on writing good concessions contracts and having good laws and policies. But certainly if the contracts are designed well, they can help in areas like that. And not just in equipment and infrastructure within the park. It can be things like the concessionaire might need an improved road that benefits not only the concessionaire, but other people, even if they don't use the concessionaire services. They might need to improve cell phone service and put in a tower, or improve water or electricity access. So there are a lot of public services in the infrastructure side, in addition to just things like boats and trucks and the like.
In general, who or what are the main types of operators of a park? Are they like hotels? Are they like shopping mall companies? Are they like logistical transportation companies? How do you classify? I mean, what kind of feature do they have in general?
With the small scale, and maybe Joe can talk about the specific case of these very large organizations. So the ones that the most common ones are actually local people. Local people, like in the United States, ranching families that have a fazenda. They have a ranch right next to a national park, and they've been there 5 generations, okay? They have traditionally been dude ranchers. They've had ranches where they also allow people to stay on their ranches. They offer horseback rides. They offer sport hunting, which I know is prohibited in Brazil, but it's really big in the United States as a major recreational activity. Sport fishing, backcountry skiing, and the like. So these kind of people have the skills already, or they are adventure sports advocates. They are surfers. They are windsurfers. They are mountain climbers. They are mountain bikers. They are road bikers. So they have an interest in that area, and they grew up doing it, and they turn it into an enterprise to basically make money doing what they've always loved to do. So you get these 2 types of people that often are those that end up being small-scale entrepreneurs in things like sport fishing or mountain biking and the like, and that basically are the majority of the concessionaires for these small-scale enterprises, usually locally owned, or people who've been in the community for quite some time, and that have a love for what they do, and they have abilities. Now, I'll let Jo talk about the big companies that do the hotels and restaurants and gift shops and service stations and the like, which are quite different from what I just described.
So what's interesting about the concessions in general is these small concessioners that Jim is discussing, they generate about 80% of the contracts in the U.S., but they only generate about 20% of the revenue. So on the flip side are these large concessioners who in the U.S. are about 20% of contracts, but they generate 80% of the revenue. So very large contracts in large iconic parks similar to Iguazu, such as the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. We have these companies who are primarily what you would classify as hospitality-based companies, but they are, many of them, in the U.S., 3 of the 5 are multinational corporations, such as Aramark, which got its start in providing hospitality services. They now also are involved in large arenas and managing very large blocks of hotels for corporations such as Marriott. So the other characteristic that a lot of these large concessioners have is the majority of them are privately held. There is only one in the U.S. that is actually a stock corporation, and that is Aramark. Although Aramark has gone back and forth between private and public about 2 or 3 times. But most of them are privately held. They're held, another large corporation operates in the United States is a company called Delaware North. Delaware North, again, got its start in managing stadiums and also managing gambling halls. Internationally, when I look at who's operating concessions, larger concessions, I still see that hospitality connection, companies that have manage different types of aspects of hospitality management. So that's primarily who's managing the larger contracts and who's been interested in bidding in them. There are some medium-sized companies that grow out of the food and beverage industry and then branch into hotel and other types of contracts. And the U.S. calls these their medium-sized concessioners, and they represent about 30% of contracts.
Interesting. So in Brazil, since you are now starting this concession agenda, we should call all the hospitality operators like hotels, stadiums, tourist agents, everyone that's operating already in the hospitality market. So let's speak a little bit about the Brazilian opportunity. I mean, because we just learned here today that it helps a lot the hospitality or the entertainment or the tourist action in Brazil. Can you give us some numbers? I mean, what's the potential of that? I mean, because we have a few parks in Brazil that are concession. I'm a fan of that. I go with my family for many years in those parks, and many of those are not carried, so we don't have many visitors. But what's the potential of this if you do a proper job and you can have, let's say, have dozens, maybe hundreds of parks concession in Brazil? How much can that increase? I mean, can you give us some figures about that or some benchmark as well?
Well, I know that only within the last 5 years, and Jo might have additional information, in the United States, basically the bureaus of the government that keep economic statistics now classify as a separate sector for record keeping the outdoor recreation industry. Now, this is not just national parks. We have very large systems of state and local parks, and much outdoor recreation happens in buffer communities outside of our protected areas. But the outdoor recreation industry is now considered to be a sector in the United States that is as big or bigger than many traditionally important economic sectors. Jo, am I right that it's around 2% of the entire economy is
That's
outdoor
correct.
recreation?
Yeah.
Okay. And that's in a massive country like the United States. Now, the smaller the country and the more natural it is, the higher the figure can get. You know, tourism is the #1 source of income for many Caribbean islands and countries like Belize or Costa Rica, okay, in Latin America. So you probably in some Brazilian states, that have a lot of protected areas. The figures can be much higher, like they are in Costa Rica or Belize, okay? So in some parts of Brazil, it could be the leading economic activity. But obviously in a vast country like Brazil, you can still think of it being a sector that will generate many billions of dollars. And I think it's very important here in the Brazilian case to mention, like US case, this is not just a federal issue, an ICMBio issue. In the United States, our state parks get 800 million visitors a year, whereas the national park system gets about 330. So thinking of the beautiful state parks in your most populated parts of southern Brazil, in Rio, in Sao Paulo, in Paraná, another huge opportunity is for the development of this at the state level and also to level of municipal parks and even private reserves. In Brazil, you have thousands of these, and they have an association. And just because you're a private reserve doesn't mean that you know how to do everything in the private sector. So many good private reserves around the world also use concessions and outsource different activities with other parts of the private sector because they know that they're not good hotel operators or restaurant operators or good guides. So there's vast opportunity in Brazil for dramatically increasing the economic benefit of outdoor recreation, including in this the role of concessions and public-private partnerships.
Jim, let's stop there for a moment because I'm really surprised for the numbers you just mentioned. If I got it right, you said that to have 1.1 billion visitors per year in the US parks, because 800 million in the states plus 300 million in the federal.
It's even more because our national forest system gets 200 million and our municipal parks and private nature reserves get hundreds of millions as well.
And also you mentioned that is 2% of US GDP, right? That's what you said.
Around there, yeah.
Oh, that's impressive. So more than 1 billion visitors in US and 2% of a huge GDP. So imagine in the Brazilian case, we have such a big agenda ahead. And I think I'm trying to imagine how can that transform both our countryside in Brazil for the people that live there and also our tourist visitors as well, because we always inquire ourselves why Brazil receives so low quantity of visitors every year. And we're quite convinced that improving the concession parks and having more quality of service, having more hospitality opportunities and options, that will promote the market for sure. I'm loving this session. I think we're getting out of here with many lessons learned, and I took notes of the outcomes, and I will do our homework here. Is there anything that we should mention, Georgine, that we didn't mention so far? You think any message that we're skipping here?
No, I would just like to commend Brazil on the important steps it has taken with support from your bank, ICMBio, state governments, many nonprofit partners like SEMEA, IPE, Boticário, in working together to show that through public-private partnerships, it will be possible to make Brazilian protected areas and parks more user-friendly, to help generate additional revenues and improve staffing, improve infrastructure in protected areas, provide economic benefits for local communities, and eventually become a much more vital economic sector in Brazil. And the last thing I would like to mention, we haven't mentioned, the companies that sell outdoor equipment can be incredibly important allies. In the United States, they have nationwide and statewide and local organizations. All of the interest groups, like the mountain bikers, the sport fishermen, the sport hunters, have numerous groups that lobby Congress asking for more infrastructure, better facilities in the parks. The equipment manufacturers and sellers, the Nikes and the Patagonias and the North Face, all of these companies have outlets in Brazil, but I haven't seen them get involved at all in this discourse. In the United States, they play a very important role and lobby actively Congress to increase funding for outdoor recreation and to make more opportunities for people to enjoy their parks. So I think that sector also needs to be engaged as well, that commerce sector involved in selling outdoor equipment and promoting greater appreciation and use of the outdoors by the Brazilian public.
Excellent. Thanks for the note. I will provoke my retail clients to wait for me. I will call you to discuss the opportunity. And Joe, before you mention, I just took some notes here. I would like to read my notes in trying to see if I learn from our session, right? First, parks concession is not a fiscal play. It's not for the federal government to make more money. It's not the goal. The goal is to support the local community, like evolving the small entrepreneurship there, and also preserving people living in the countryside. It's a hospitality business, right? It's like improving the tourist visitors and tourist opportunities in Brazil. We should also think on the preparing and equipping the regulator or the concessionaire, how do we call that, to supervise and to manage all those contracts. They also should, when I say they, the regulator or the agent should also have some benefit from the revenues from the concession, either through financial support or infrastructure, facilities, whatever. And also, we should not forget about the small concessionaires, because once you bring the 80% revenue bigger ones, we're going to promote a lot of the small ones. And lastly, as Jim just said, let's provoke our retail clients to join this journey. Did I got it right, Jo? Or you'd recommend anything additional note?
I think you're a great student. I'm sure Jim would love to have you in his classes. But one thing that we had talked about previously, I wanted to bring up, and that is how you can help these smaller parks that may not have the ability to have revenue generating or revenue positive concession contracts, is to bundle contracts. So if you have a large park such in Rio de Janeiro, you may want to take some smaller parks and have a concessionaire take both the large park contract and the smaller park contracts, knowing that this is going to impact your revenue, because the concessionaire would be able to use its revenue gains from the larger park to offset its losses by operating in a smaller park. Because remember, what we're looking at is providing quality services to visitors, as well as job opportunities for the local community. So having the ability to bundle contracts, I think, is really something important for you to look at. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is about maybe some of the trends that Jim and I see emerging in concession opportunities. One of the biggest things that I see in smaller to medium-sized countries is ecotourism activities for visitors. If you're, depending on your clientele, if you're trying to draw the European or the American visitor, what they are now looking for are really remote ecotourism concession opportunities. Those can be easily done in concession contracts, ensuring that there's a small footprint and that they're sustainable, and even providing that guest the opportunity to pay back, if you will, is a very important aspect of ecotourism these days, giving that visitor the opportunity to work on a trail or do something in that park for the time that they're staying there. So those are some of the things that we see as trends in concession opportunities.
Excellent. So, Jim and Jo, thank you very much for your time. I think it was a lovely conversation. We learned so much, and I wish that we can really improve this industry in Brazil. Thank you so much. It was very, very helpful, and you contributed a lot to our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Gustavo.
Então, obrigado para você que acompanhou esse nosso incrível e rico bate-papo aqui com a Jo e com o Jim. E se você gostou, tem interesse, quer aprender mais sobre o tema, vem aprender com a gente, compartilhe esse vídeo com os amigos. O que a gente quer é justamente promover o debate, espalhar o conhecimento de exploração de parques, concessão de ecoturismo, que essa atividade econômica ela vai ajudar muito o pequeno empresário no interior do Brasil e preservar o nosso meio ambiente. E junto a gente vai aprender e desenvolver esse ecoturismo brasileiro. Obrigado e até a próxima semana no nosso BNDES Verde.